The Soviet Union in the early 1980s was a land of contradictions. On the one hand, it was a global superpower. It possessed a massive nuclear arsenal and a formidable military. It had a sphere of influence that extended across Eastern Europe and beyond. On the other hand, behind the facade of power, cracks were beginning to show. The Soviet economy was stagnating. The shelves of its stores were often bare. A sense of disillusionment was growing among its citizens. The contrast was stark. The Soviet Union had emerged victorious from World War II. It had made significant strides in science and technology, even launching the first satellite, Sputnik, into space. Yet by the 1980s, the promise of prosperity and equality seemed elusive. The Soviet system, once a source of pride, was now seen by many as inefficient and oppressive. The Soviet Union's leadership, aging and out of touch, seemed unable to address the growing problems. The country was ripe for change. The question was, what kind of change and at what cost? The seeds of the Soviet Union's demise were sown during the long rule of Leonid Brezhnev. His tenure, which lasted from 1964 to 1982, was a period marked by significant political and economic developments that would shape the future of the Soviet state. From 1964 to 1982, Brezhnev presided over an era of economic stagnation and political repression. This period, often referred to as the era of stagnation, saw the Soviet economy falter under the weight of its own inefficiencies and systemic corruption. This period, known as the era of stagnation, saw a decline in living standards and a rise in corruption. The Soviet citizens experienced a noticeable drop in their quality of life, with urban areas becoming increasingly dilapidated and the gap between the government and the people widening. Brezhnev's focus on heavy industry and military spending came at the expense of consumer goods. The leadership prioritized the production of steel, coal, and military hardware over the needs of the average citizen, leading to a severe imbalance in the economy. The result was chronic shortages of basic necessities. Items that were taken for granted in other parts of the world became rare commodities in the Soviet Union, leading to widespread frustration and discontent among the populace. Long lines became a common sight in Soviet cities. People would spend hours, sometimes even days, waiting in queues for food, clothing, and other essential goods, a stark contrast to the promises of prosperity made by the Soviet regime. Meanwhile, the Soviet government poured resources into propping up communist regimes in other countries, further straining the economy. This international ambition drained the Soviet coffers, leaving less for domestic development and exacerbating the economic woes at home. Politically, the Brezhnev era was marked by a crackdown on dissent. The government employed a heavy-handed approach to silence any opposition, using the KGB and other security forces to maintain a tight grip on power. Those who dared to criticize the government were silenced. Show trials and political imprisonments became tools of the state to instill fear and suppress any form of rebellion or dissent. Freedom of speech and assembly were severely restricted. The state controlled the media, censored literature, and kept a close watch on its citizens, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust. The KGB, the Soviet security agency, became increasingly powerful. Its influence permeated all aspects of Soviet life, from politics to everyday activities, ensuring that the state's authority remained unchallenged. This atmosphere of fear and repression stifled creativity and innovation. Artists, intellectuals, and scientists found themselves constrained by the state's rigid control, unable to freely express their ideas or pursue groundbreaking research. When Brezhnev died in 1982, he left behind a country in deep trouble. The Soviet Union was grappling with economic stagnation, political repression, and a disillusioned populace, setting the stage for a turbulent future. His two successors, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, were both elderly and in poor health. Their brief tenures did little to address the systemic issues plaguing the Soviet Union. as they largely continued Brezhnev's policies without significant reform. Their brief tenures were marked by a continuation of Brezhnev's policies and a failure to address the Soviet Union's mounting problems. The lack of effective leadership during this period only deepened the crisis, leaving the country in a precarious state. The stage was set for a new leader, one who promised change. Mikhail Gorbachev would soon rise to power, bringing with him a vision of reform and a glimmer of hope for a nation in desperate need of transformation. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This marked the beginning of a new era in Soviet politics. At 54, he was the youngest Soviet leader in decades, bringing a fresh perspective to the aging leadership. Gorbachev represented a break from the past. He was energetic, charismatic, and determined to reform the stagnant Soviet system. His vision was to modernize the Soviet Union and make it more efficient and responsive to the needs of its people. Gorbachev introduced two key reforms, perestroika and glasnost. These reforms were aimed at addressing the deep-rooted issues within the Soviet Union. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, aimed to revitalize the Soviet economy. It sought to decentralize economic control and introduce elements of market economics. It involved introducing elements of market economics, such as limited private enterprise. This was a significant shift from the centrally planned economy that had dominated the Soviet Union for decades. Glasnost, meaning openness, aimed to increase transparency and freedom of expression. It was designed to encourage more open communication and reduce the corruption that had plagued the Soviet government. It allowed for greater freedom of the press and encouraged open discussion of previously taboo subjects. This was a radical departure from the strict censorship that had been the norm. Gorbachev's reforms, while well-intentioned, had unintended consequences. The introduction of market elements led to economic disruption and shortages. Perestroika led to economic disruption and shortages. The Soviet economy, already struggling, was not prepared for the rapid changes. Glasnost unleashed a torrent of criticism of the Soviet government. People began to openly criticize the government and demand more significant changes. The Soviet people, long silenced, were now free to voice their grievances. This newfound freedom of expression led to a surge in public activism and protest. Moreover, Gorbachev's reforms had a ripple effect throughout the Soviet Empire. The changes in the Soviet Union inspired movements for reform in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, communist regimes began to crumble as people demanded greater freedom and democracy. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the collapse of communist control in the region. The Soviet Union, weakened by its own internal problems, was unable to prevent the collapse of its satellite states. The once mighty Soviet Empire was unraveling, leading to the end of the Cold War era. The Soviet Union was not a monolithic entity. It was a vast and diverse conglomerate of nations, each with its own unique identity and aspirations. The central government in Moscow often struggled to maintain control over this sprawling empire. It was composed of 15 republics, each with its own distinct history, culture, and language. These republics were not just administrative divisions, they were home to peoples with deep-rooted traditions and a strong sense of national identity. The Soviet leadership's attempts to create a unified Soviet identity often clashed with these local identities. Under Gorbachev's reforms, long-suppressed nationalist sentiments resurfaced with a vengeance. His policies of glasnost and perestroika, aimed at opening up the Soviet society and economy, inadvertently provided a platform for these nationalist movements to express their grievances and aspirations. The loosening of state control allowed people to voice their demands for greater autonomy and independence. The Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which had been forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940, were at the forefront of this nationalist resurgence. These nations had a strong sense of their own history and identity. and they never fully accepted Soviet rule. The memory of their brief independence between the world wars fueled their desire to break free from Soviet control. In 1989, the Baltic states held mass demonstrations calling for independence. These protests were not just about political freedom, they were also about reclaiming their cultural heritage and national pride. The people of the Baltic states were determined to restore their sovereignty and reassert their place in the world as independent nations. The Baltic Way demonstration, in which an estimated 2 million people joined hands to form a human chain stretching from Tallinn to Vilnius, was a powerful symbol of their desire for freedom. This peaceful protest demonstrated the unity and resolve of the Baltic peoples. It was a clear message to the Soviet authorities and the world that they were serious about their quest for independence. Gorbachev, facing mounting pressure at home, refrained from using force against the Baltic states. His decision not to crack down on these movements was influenced by both internal and external factors. Domestically, he was dealing with a crumbling economy and growing dissent. Internationally, he sought to improve relations with the West and avoid the negative repercussions of a violent suppression. Nationalist tensions also flared in the Caucasus region. This area, known for its ethnic diversity and complex history, became a hotbed of nationalist activity. The various ethnic groups in the Caucasus had long-standing grievances and aspirations for greater autonomy or independence. In 1988, a long-running territorial dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the Nagorno-Karabakh region erupted into violence. This conflict was rooted in historical claims and ethnic tensions, and it quickly escalated into a full-blown war. The violence and instability in the region highlighted the Soviet Union's inability to manage its internal conflicts. The conflict, which claimed thousands of lives, exposed the fragility of the Soviet Union and its inability to manage ethnic conflicts. The Soviet government's failure to effectively address the root causes of these disputes only exacerbated the situation. The violence in Nagorno-Karabakh was a stark reminder of the deep-seated issues that plagued the Soviet Union. Georgia, too, saw a surge in nationalist sentiment, with mass demonstrations demanding independence. The Georgian people, like those in the Baltic states, were determined to reclaim their sovereignty and cultural identity. The protests in Georgia were a clear indication that the desire for independence was spreading across the Soviet republics. Gorbachev's attempts to balance reform with the preservation of the Soviet Union were failing. His policies, while well-intentioned, were unable to contain the growing tide of nationalism. The more he tried to reform the system, the more it seemed to unravel. The Soviet Union was facing an existential crisis. The empire was cracking, and the centrifugal forces of nationalism were pulling it apart. The Soviet Union, once a formidable superpower, was now on the brink of disintegration. The rise of nationalist movements in the Republic signaled the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. The dream of a unified Soviet identity was fading, giving way to the aspirations of individual nations. Gap 2S. As nationalist movements surged across the Soviet republics, the central authority in Moscow faced its greatest challenge yet. In August 1991, hardliners within the KGB, military and Communist Party leadership made a desperate attempt to reverse Gorbachev's reforms and preserve the Soviet Union. Gap 2S. While on vacation in Crimea, Gorbachev was kidnapped by these hardliners who declared a state of emergency. They aimed to roll back the changes that had unleashed the forces of nationalism and dissent. This was a pivotal moment, a last-ditch effort to save the crumbling empire. Gap 2S. In Moscow, the world watched as Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, emerged as a symbol of defiance. Standing atop a tank outside the Russian White House, Yeltsin called on the people to resist the coup. His courageous stance galvanized the crowds, who flooded the streets to block the troops and protect the fragile reforms. Gap 2S. The coup collapsed within 3 days, its failure a testament to the power of popular resistance and the deep desire for change. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but his authority was irreparably damaged. The Communist Party, once the unchallenged ruler of the Soviet Union, was banned. Gap 2S. The August coup marked the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. It exposed the deep divisions within the Soviet leadership and underscored the unstoppable momentum of the forces tearing the empire apart. The dream of a unified Soviet identity was shattered, and the Republic's aspirations for independence were now unstoppable. The stage was set for the final dissolution of the Soviet Union, a seismic event that would reshape the global order. As the dust settled from the failed August coup, the Soviet Union entered its final tumultuous months. The republics, emboldened by the coup's collapse and the waning power of Moscow, began to break away in a dramatic cascade of independence declarations. On December 1st, 1991, Ukraine held a referendum where an overwhelming 90% of voters supported independence. This decisive moment set off a chain reaction. Belarus, Kazakhstan, and many other republics quickly followed suit, each eager to chart their own course away from the Soviet Union. Just a week later, on December 8, 1991, a historic meeting took place in the Belovezha forest. Boris Yeltsin, along with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus, declared the Soviet Union effectively dead. This was not merely a political maneuver. It was an acknowledgement that the once mighty Soviet Empire had disintegrated beyond repair. Finally, on December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. In a poignant and symbolic moment, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the Russian tricolor. The Soviet Union, which had once been a superpower that shaped global history, was no more. The dissolution of the Soviet Union marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new world order. It was a moment filled with uncertainty, hope, and the promise of new beginnings for the people of the former Soviet republics. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was inevitable, driven by 3 crucial factors that sealed its fate. First, the economic collapse. The centrally planned economy, burdened with inefficiencies and unable to adapt, spiraled into a crisis. The system resisted reforms, and Gorbachev's attempts to introduce market elements only deepened the chaos. Second, nationalism surged across the republics. After decades of Soviet rule, the desire for self-determination and freedom grew unstoppable. From the Baltic states to Central Asia, republics sought to break free from Moscow's grip, each yearning to reclaim their unique identities and chart their own futures. Lastly, leadership failure played a pivotal role. Gorbachev's reforms aimed at revitalizing the Soviet Union backfired spectacularly. Glasnost and perestroika, instead of strengthening the state, exposed its weaknesses and accelerated its fragmentation. As the leaders struggled to maintain control, the very fabric of the Soviet Union unraveled. These 3 factors, economic collapse, rising nationalism, and leadership failure, converged to bring about the end of the USSR. It was a monumental collapse that reshaped the global landscape and left an indelible mark on history. As the dust settled on the fallen Soviet Union, a new era dawned for its former republics. Nations that had once been united under the hammer and sickle now faced the challenge of forging their own paths. From the Baltic Sea to the Caucasus Mountains, each republic embarked on a unique journey toward independence and self-governance. In the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania swiftly embraced democracy and market economies, eager to integrate with Western Europe. Their transformations were rapid, marked by economic reforms and a strong push for NATO and EU membership. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, countries like Ukraine and Belarus grappled with political instability and economic hardships. The legacies of Soviet rule lingered, complicating their transitions. Yet, amidst the struggles, a burgeoning sense of national identity began to take root. Central Asia's republics, rich in natural resources, faced different challenges. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan navigated the delicate balance between authoritarian governments and economic development. Their paths were shaped by unique cultural and historical contexts, leading to diverse outcomes. In the Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan and Georgia dealt with ethnic conflicts and territorial disputes. The region's complex history fueled tensions, but also fostered resilience and a determination to rebuild. The dissolution of the USSR not only reshaped borders, but also redefined the global geopolitical landscape. The emergence of these new nations brought fresh opportunities and challenges as they sought to establish their place in the world. The story of the Soviet Union's collapse is not just one of endings, but of new beginnings. The rise of these nations continues to unfold, each chapter adding to the rich tapestry of history. Music fades out, transitioning to the outro. Scene 9, outro, emotion, 2 music upbeat, encouraging the USSR was gone. But what came next? Like and subscribe if you want a sequel.